Carl Jung noticed a pattern of misunderstanding so consistent and so deeply rooted that he considered it one of the most common sources of conflict in close relationships, families, and workplaces alike. It was not a misunderstanding caused by malice or stupidity or genuine bad character on either side. It was something far more structural and far more difficult to correct, a kind of built-in blind spot that caused the two fundamental personality orientations he had identified, the outward-facing extroverted orientation and the inward-facing introverted orientation, to almost inevitably misjudge and undervalue one another, each one interpreting the other's genuine and legitimate way of being through a lens that made it look, at best, strange and inefficient, and at worst, genuinely deficient. Jung observed that an extroverted person, whose own psychic energy naturally flowed outward toward people, activity, and external engagement, tended to evaluate an introverted person's quieter, more inward orientation almost entirely from the outside, judging it by its visible external effects rather than by any genuine understanding of what was actually happening within. From this outside vantage point, the introvert's need for solitude looked like antisocial withdrawal. Their careful, internally processed reflection, which might take considerable time before producing any visible external result, looked like hesitation, indecisiveness, or a lack of genuine engagement with real life. Their reluctance to share half-formed thoughts before they had been fully worked through looked like secrecy or coldness. The extravert, evaluating everything by its external, visible expression, simply had no natural framework for understanding that a rich and genuinely valuable process might be occurring entirely within someone's private inner world, invisible and therefore, to the purely externally oriented observer, apparently absent altogether. The introvert, meanwhile, made a strikingly similar error in the opposite direction. Evaluating the extrovert primarily through the lens of their own inward orientation, the introvert tended to interpret the extrovert's outward engagement, their comfort with rapid conversation, their ease in large groups, their willingness to think out loud and act quickly without extensive private deliberation as evidence of a certain shallowness, a lack of genuine depth, as though anything expressed so readily and so quickly to the outside world could not possibly carry the same weight and substance as the introvert's own carefully guarded inner reflections. The introvert, just as much as the extrovert, struggled to imagine that a genuinely rich inner life might actually accompany this outward ease, assuming instead that visible, rapid external expression must indicate an absence of any real depth underneath. What made this mutual misjudgment so persistent and so difficult to correct in Jung's understanding was that each side was, in a very real sense, using the wrong measuring instrument to evaluate the other, and neither side could easily recognize this error, because each was so thoroughly embedded in their own natural orientation that it felt, to them, like simply seeing things as they obviously and objectively were. The extrovert was not being deliberately unfair when they concluded that the introvert's inner life was probably rather thin and uneventful, since they were judging by the only evidence genuinely available to their own natural way of perceiving external and visible expression. The introvert was not being deliberately unfair when they concluded that the extrovert's rapid outward engagement probably lacked real substance, since they too were judging by the only evidence genuinely available to their own natural way of perceiving internal depth and reflection. Both were making an honest error, but it was an error built directly into the structure of their own particular type, making it genuinely difficult for either side to simply reason their way out of it through goodwill alone. Jung believed this pattern helped explain a great deal of ordinary everyday relational friction that often gets misattributed to more dramatic causes, poor character, lack of love, fundamental incompatibility, when the actual root cause was often this simpler and more structural mutual blindness between two legitimate but fundamentally different ways of engaging with reality. A parent and child, a husband and wife, two close friends or colleagues may find themselves locked in exactly this pattern for years, each one quietly convinced that the other's fundamentally different orientation represents some kind of deficiency to be corrected, rather than recognizing it as a genuinely different and equally legitimate way of processing experience that simply cannot be accurately evaluated using the standards of the opposite type. The way through this pattern, according to Jung's understanding, required something genuinely difficult, a willingness to actually accept on faith and without full comprehension that the opposite type's way of experiencing reality carried its own genuine depth and its own genuine validity, even though it could never be fully verified or directly witnessed from the outside, the way your own type's experience could. The extrovert had to accept that the introvert's quiet, invisible inner processing was genuinely substantial, even though this substance could never be directly observed or measured the way the extrovert instinctively wanted to measure things. The introvert had to accept that the extrovert's rapid outward engagement genuinely could carry real depth, even though this depth expressed itself in a form that felt to the introvert's own instincts suspiciously quick and insufficiently deliberated. This acceptance is genuinely difficult precisely because it requires each type to trust something they cannot directly perceive or verify using their own natural instruments of evaluation, a kind of humility about the limits of your own particular way of seeing that does not come naturally to anyone, regardless of which orientation they happen to favor. But Jung believed this humility was essential for genuine understanding across this particular divide, since no amount of simply trying harder to see things the other person's way would actually succeed if it was still being attempted through the lens of your own fundamentally different orientation. There is a particular practice worth considering if you find yourself in a close relationship with someone whose basic orientation differs significantly from your own. Rather than trying to evaluate their behavior by the standards your own type naturally applies, whether that means demanding visible, immediate external evidence of depth from an introvert or demanding lengthy, careful internal deliberation from an extrovert before you will credit their engagement as genuine, it may be more useful to simply ask them directly with real curiosity rather than quiet judgment what is actually happening for them in the moments your own instincts are quietly interpreting as deficient. This direct inquiry, imperfect as it necessarily is, offers a way around the structural blindness that neither side can fully overcome through observation alone. Think honestly about a close relationship in your own life with someone whose basic orientation, outward or inward, differs noticeably from your own, and consider whether you have been quietly judging their way of being using the standards of your own type, concluding they are somehow deficient rather than simply different. Ask yourself what you might actually learn if you set aside your own instinctive standard of evaluation and ask them directly what their own experience genuinely feels like from the inside. If you can identify someone in your own life whose orientation differs from yours and whom you have perhaps quietly misjudged, write below the single word for what you have assumed about their inner experience without ever actually asking them. Naming this assumption honestly is often the first step toward the genuine curiosity that alone can bridge this particular divide. Because the mutual misunderstanding Carl Jung identified between these two fundamental orientations was never a sign that one type was simply better or more complete than the other. It was, he insisted, one of the oldest and most structural blind spots in all of human relationship, correctable not through effort alone, but through the humility to admit that your own way of seeing was never the only genuine way to be fully and legitimately human.